March 23, 1943. Pre-dawn in the El Guettar Valley, Tunisia. Men of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division wait in freshly dug foxholes, listening to the approaching mechanical rumble of the veteran German 10th Panzer Division. Barely 30 days earlier, the American army was humiliated and routed at the Kasserine Pass. German commanders dismissed them as an amateur force, entirely incapable of surviving a modern mechanized war. By all conventional military logic, the green infantrymen sitting in this valley are about to be slaughtered. Can a defeated army rewrite its entire tactical identity in a single month? Or is Kasserine about to repeat itself on a much bloodier scale? What happens here in the Tunisian desert is not just another isolated skirmish. It is a forensic case study in how a military institution adapts under the immediate threat of total annihilation. We will track the exact mechanical, logistical, and doctrinal adjustments the U.S. Second Corps was forced to make in the narrow, frantic window between their greatest humiliation and this critical stand. The central tension is not simply about holding a valley. It is about whether an inexperienced army can process fatal errors in real time and transform its command culture before an elite adversary shatters it permanently. It is a desperate race against the clock, pitting rapid American adaptation against the inevitable momentum of the next German armored thrust. But to understand how these infantrymen even stood a chance when the sun rose on March 23rd, we first have to look backward. We must examine the brutal internal revolution that tore through the U.S. Second Corps in the immediate, panicked aftermath of the Kasserine disaster. The reality of mid-February 1943 was that the United States Second Corps had not merely been beaten at Kasserine, it had been dismantled. The physical losses were severe, over 6,000 casualties, hundreds of destroyed tanks, and miles of abandoned artillery pieces littering the Tunisian passes. But the true casualty was institutional confidence. The troops had lost faith in their equipment, which had proven fatally inferior to German armor. And worse, they had lost faith in their own command structure. The pre-war American defensive doctrine, which relied on spreading forces thin to cover multiple avenues of approach, had been sliced apart by concentrated German armored thrusts. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower recognized that this was a fundamental crisis of leadership. On March 6th, he relieved the paralyzed commander of Second Corps, Major General Lloyd Friedendahl, and replaced him with Major General George S. Patton. Patton did not arrive with a gentle hand. He understood that a shattered army could not be rebuilt with mere pep talks. It required a violent shock to its internal culture. He instantly instituted a regime of rigid, uncompromising discipline. Severe fines were levied for unbuckled chin straps. Officers were required to wear neckties in the blistering desert heat. To the exhausted infantrymen, it felt like rear echelon harassment, but Patton's logic was brutally pragmatic. An army that cannot execute basic uniform regulations in a secure staging area will not execute complex tactical maneuvers while under artillery fire. Automatic obedience had to be reinstalled before the Germans returned. However, polished helmets do not stop Panzer Mark IVs. While Patton reformed the psychology of the Corps, the granular work of rewriting American defensive doctrine fell to Major General Terry Allen and the men of the 1st Infantry Division. They had a matter of days to unlearn the fatal habits of Kasserine. The old blueprint dictated deploying tank destroyers and infantry in isolated, penny-packet strongpoints that German commanders easily bypassed or destroyed in detail. Allen discarded this entirely. Approaching El Guettar, a sprawling, arid valley bracketed by harsh mountainous ridges, the 1st Infantry Division anchored its defense directly onto the rugged terrain. Instead of sitting in the valley floor waiting to be flanked, American infantry dug deeply into the steep, rocky slopes of Jebel Kherua to the north and Jebel El Ankh to the south. The engineers worked feverishly against the clock, laying thousands of anti-tank mines across the valley floor. Crucially, these were not just scattered randomly. They were arranged in dense, meticulously camouflaged patterns designed to act as a lethal funnel. Behind these minefields, the artillery was completely reorganized. Gone were the days of batteries fighting isolated independent duels. The big guns were consolidated, and forward observers spent hours pre-registering their fire on specific grid coordinates along the valley floor. The new operational theory was simple but required absolute nerve. The infantry must stay in their holes, let the enemy armor advance into the minefields, and then annihilate them with concentrated, overlapping artillery barrages. They would not have to wait long to test this unproven theory. Across the lines, the strategic pressure on the Axis forces was reaching a critical threshold. German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, was looking at a shrinking map. General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army was hammering at the Mareth Line to the east. If the Americans pushed east from El Guettar and reached the sea, the Axis forces in North Africa would be cut in two and destroyed. To prevent this, von Arnim devised Operation Eilboat 1, a spoiling attack designed to crush the Allied southern flank and throw the Americans back into the mountains. To execute this critical blow, von Arnim deployed the 10th Panzer Division. These were the same hardened veterans who had spearheaded the slaughter at Kasserine just a month prior. They had no reason to respect American combat capabilities. They had seen the Americans break, run, and abandon their positions. As the early morning mist began to lift over the El Guettar Valley on March 23rd, the distinct, heavy clatter of German tracks echoed off the canyon walls. The panzers rolled forward in deep formation, their commanders peering through their cupolas, fully expecting the green American lines to shatter upon contact, exactly as they had before. At exactly 6 o'clock, the vanguard of the 10th Panzer Division struck. German tanks emerged from the morning haze, moving confidently down the valley floor, accompanied by half-tracks and veteran infantry deploying in textbook formation. Their tactical objective was straightforward: punch directly through the center, induce immediate panic, and ruthlessly exploit the resulting chaos. But at El Guettar, the panic never materialized. Instead of a rapid breakthrough, the lead German tanks suddenly lurched to violent, grinding halts. Tracks snapped and road wheels shattered in geysers of sand and smoke. The armored spearhead had slammed squarely into the massive, meticulously concealed minefield the American engineers had laid across the valley floor. The inevitable momentum of the German assault evaporated in seconds. As the armor stalled, the true psychological test of the newly reformed American army began. Up in the rocky foothills flanking the valley, the men of the 1st Infantry Division watched the steel behemoths bottleneck just hundreds of yards away. Basic human instinct screams at an infantryman to break and run when faced with 50 tons of hostile armor. But the orders passed down the line were absolute. Hold your ground, stay in your foxholes, and let the tanks pass. The American riflemen and machine gunners were instructed to ignore the heavy armor entirely. Their sole target was the German infantry attempting to follow the panzers through the dust. Executing this required an agonizing level of discipline. As a handful of German tanks managed to navigate the mines and actually roll past the forward American foxholes, the GIs stayed hidden, gripping their weapons in the dirt. They waited until the enemy infantry entered the kill zone. Only then did the valley erupt. A withering crossfire poured down from the elevated slopes, pinning the German grenadiers to the desert floor. Within minutes, the fundamental mechanics of the German assault were completely dismantled. The surviving panzers pushed forward, but they were now severed from their infantry support. The 10th Panzer Division found itself immobilized and stripped of its protective shield. By holding their nerve while enemy tanks literally rolled past them, the Green American infantry had accomplished their mission. Now, with the German armor stalled and isolated in the open valley, the American commanders were ready to spring the true trap they had waiting in the hills. As the German armor sat momentarily paralyzed in the valley floor, stripped of its infantry screen, the true architecture of the American ambush revealed itself. Hidden high in the rocky defilades of Jebel Krerua and Jebel El Ankh, the anti-tank crews of the 1st Infantry Division had been watching through their optics, waiting for this exact geometry to materialize. They were not aiming at the thick, heavily sloped frontal armor of the Panzer Mark IVs and Panzer IIIs. By drawing the German spearhead deep into the center of the valley, the Americans had forced the enemy tanks to expose their far more vulnerable, thinly plated flanks to the surrounding hills. The first American weapons to open up were the dug-in 37mm anti-tank guns. In previous engagements, American infantrymen had bitterly mocked the 37mm as a squirrel rifle, complaining that its lightweight shells simply bounced off the front of German armor. But here, employed precisely as doctrine intended, firing from camouflaged, enfilading positions into the sides of the stalled vehicles, the weapon suddenly proved lethal. Armor-piercing tracer rounds zipped down from the ridges in blinding streaks, punching through the thinner side plates of the German tracks and shattering engine blocks. Simultaneously, a newly deployed asset entered the fray. The M10 tank destroyers of the 601st and 899th Tank Destroyer Battalions rolled out of their concealed hull-down positions. The M10 was an open-topped, lightly armored vehicle carrying a massive 3-inch naval-derived gun. It was designed specifically for this kind of predatory work: wait in ambush, fire a devastating high-velocity round, and immediately reverse into cover before the enemy could traverse their turrets. The high-explosive anti-tank rounds slammed into the valley floor. When a 3-inch solid shot struck the side of a Panzer at a high velocity, the kinetic energy transfer was catastrophic. Internal ammunition cooked off, turning the buttoned-up German tanks into instant, roaring crematoriums. Within a matter of minutes, the valley floor was dotted with columns of thick, oily black smoke rising from burning German steel. For the frontline commanders of the 10th Panzer Division, observing the chaos, the sudden destruction of their lead elements created acute cognitive dissonance. Through their binoculars, they were witnessing a sophisticated, highly disciplined defense, but their operational assumptions were entirely rooted in the memory of the Kasserine Pass. Just weeks earlier, they had seen American units dissolve at the first sign of concentrated fire. German officers instinctively interpreted this ambush not as a hard, unbreakable line, but as a temporary, desperate screen. Confirmation bias took hold. The veteran German commanders assumed that if they simply pushed harder, if they applied enough blunt force to the center, the American nerve would crack and the Green Infantry would abandon their positions. Barking orders over their radio networks, German platoon leaders ordered their surviving tanks to ignore the burning hulks, bypass the minefields wherever possible, and drive straight into the teeth of the American lines. They were doubling down on intimidation. The Panzers gunned their Maybach engines, their tracks churning the Tunisian sand, and pushed forward in a brutal, direct frontal assault. They expected to see the Americans scrambling out of their foxholes in a panicked retreat. Instead, they triggered the second phase of the American trap. As the Panzers accelerated, hoping to overrun the anti-tank guns by closing the distance, the American forward observers, hidden high on the ridges with field telephones, coldly spoke coordinates into their mouthpieces. Behind the mountains, out of direct line of sight, the artillery commander of the 1st Infantry Division, Brigadier General Clift Andrus, had centralized his firing batteries. In the past, American artillery had operated in small, isolated pockets, allowing the Germans to overwhelm them one by one. Today, Andrus had concentrated the 105mm and 155mm howitzers of multiple battalions into a single, synchronized network. They were already pre-registered on the exact grid coordinates the Germans were driving through. When the order to fire was given, it was not a sporadic shelling. It was a perfectly timed, overwhelming wall of steel and high explosives. Hundreds of heavy shells arced over the mountains simultaneously, screaming down into the narrow valley. The earth erupted. The concentrated barrage did not just target the tanks. It saturated the entire operational space. The physics of massed artillery against mechanized forces are brutal. While a near miss from a 155mm shell might not instantly vaporize a heavily armored tank, the concussive shockwave and razor-sharp shrapnel strip the vehicle of its combat effectiveness. German tanks were violently rocked by the concussions. Antennas were sheared off, instantly severing radio communications and blinding the platoon commanders. External optics were shattered. Tracks were blown apart, leaving the tanks immobilized in the kill zone to be picked off by the M10s. For the unarmored half-tracks and the grenadiers trying to support the assault, the barrage was an inescapable nightmare. Inside the steel hulls of the Panzers, the psychological reality for the German crews shifted rapidly from aggressive overconfidence to severe alarm. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning rubber. The noise was deafening, the ground shaking so violently that gunners could not line up their sights. This was not the chaotic, disjointed American resistance of February. This was a mechanized, mathematical slaughter. Every time a German unit attempted to maneuver out of the barrage, American spotters seamlessly shifted the artillery fire, walking the explosions back and forth across the valley floor. By late morning, the situation for the German spearhead had become completely untenable. The momentum was broken, the casualty rate was unsustainable, and the center of the American line had not yielded a single inch. Reluctantly, the German commanders ordered a tactical withdrawal. The surviving panzers popped smoke grenades and reversed out of the kill zone, retreating to the eastern end of the valley to regroup, leaving behind a graveyard of smoldering vehicles. A momentary, eerie silence fell over El Guettar, but the battle was far from over. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, receiving the reports of the stalled attack, refused to accept that his elite 10th Panzer Division had been halted by the same troops they had previously routed. The strategic stakes were too high. If they did not break the Americans here, the entire Axis position in North Africa was doomed. Von Arnim ordered a second, far more desperate offensive to be launched in the afternoon. But this time, he understood that to break the American infantry, he first had to blind them. He had to eliminate the artillery and the forward observers on the ridges. For that, he called upon the Luftwaffe. At approximately 1645 hours, the distinct, menacing drone of aircraft engines echoed down the valley. The American infantrymen looked up to see formations of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, the dreaded German dive bombers, dropping out of the sun. The Stuka was a psychological weapon as much as a tactical one, equipped with wind-driven sirens known as the Jericho trumpets that emitted a terrifying, banshee-like wail as the plane entered a steep dive. The objective was clear: shatter the nerves of the American gun crews, force them to abandon their posts, and pave the way for a renewed armored assault. As the Stukas pitched nose down and began their screaming dives, releasing heavy bombs that violently shook the bedrock of the valley, the 10th Panzer Division surged forward for a second time. The German armor advanced with renewed ferocity, hoping to catch the Americans paralyzed by the aerial bombardment. It was a coordinated, combined arms shock tactic that had broken armies across Europe, but the American line held its nerve. The psychological reforms implemented by George Patton, combined with the rigorous tactical discipline enforced by Terry Allen, paid off in the ultimate crucible. The American anti-aircraft batteries, armed with quad 50 caliber machine guns and 37mm flak guns mounted on half-tracks, refused to take cover. Instead, they stood fully exposed in the open beds of their vehicles, tracking the diving Stukas through their ring sights and pouring ribbons of tracer fire into the sky. The air filled with the black puffs of flak and the violent crisscross of defensive fire. Several Stukas were shredded in mid-air, crashing into the desert in spectacular fireballs. More importantly, the American artillerymen behind the ridges did not flinch. Despite the bombs detonating around their positions, throwing geysers of rock and dirt into the air, the gun crews remained exactly where they were. They continuously slammed fresh shells into the breeches of their howitzers, pulling the lanyards and maintaining their devastating rate of fire. As the second wave of German panzers hit the valley floor, they drove straight into the exact same synchronized wall of artillery that had broken them in the morning. The afternoon assault disintegrated under the relentless, overlapping fire. German tanks found themselves caught in an impenetrable web of high explosives, anti-tank fire, and mines. By dusk on March 23rd, the 10th Panzer Division had suffered a staggering tactical defeat. They were forced to withdraw entirely, leaving over 30 destroyed tanks, nearly a third of their operational armor in the sector, littering the valley of El Guettar. Back at Axis headquarters, the reports coming in from the frontline commanders painted a grim and undeniable picture. The shock was palpable. The German command was forced into the bitter, unsettling recognition that the enemy they were facing was no longer an amateur force. In the span of just 1 month, the Americans had fundamentally rewritten their tactical doctrine, mastered combined arms synchronization, and demonstrated a terrifying level of combat discipline. The American army had rapidly evolved, and the strategic balance in North Africa had irreversibly shifted. By the evening of March 23rd, the American defensive doctrine had achieved a stunning, undeniable triumph. They had proven they could absorb the best the Wehrmacht had to throw at them and grind it into scrap metal. But victory on the battlefield is rarely a static condition. Intoxicated by this sudden, overwhelming success, the American commanders immediately made a fateful decision that would turn a defensive success into a bloody, attritional nightmare. Framing Guettar purely as a flawless American triumph ignores the grim reality of the days that immediately followed. Eager to exploit the shattered momentum of the 10th Panzer Division, George Patton and the 2nd Corps Command Staff ordered an immediate, large-scale counteroffensive. The objective was to push the 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions up into the rugged, towering peaks flanking the valley to completely dislodge the remaining Axis forces and open the road east. This sudden operational shift, however, exposed a glaring flaw in the rapidly evolving American tactical playbook. The troops had just mastered the art of the static ambush, but launching a coordinated mountain assault was an entirely different science. By climbing out of their foxholes and advancing uphill, the American infantry instantly forfeited the exact advantages that had just saved them. They left behind their meticulously camouflaged minefields, their established kill zones, and the safety of their pre-registered artillery grids. As the American riflemen began their grueling, exposed climb into the jagged defilades, they walked directly into the crosshairs of deeply entrenched German and Italian mountain troops. The Axis defenders had spent weeks turning the high ground into a fortress, carving overlapping machine gun nests and concealed mortar pits into the solid rock. Without the protective architecture of their valley defenses, the advancing GIs were systematically pinned down by plunging fire. The sweeping ambition of the American High Command violently collided with the brutal tactical reality of Alpine warfare. Rather than a decisive breakthrough, the grand offensive quickly bogged down into a series of disjointed, bloody stalemates. The broad push shrank into an agonizing, close-quarters struggle for a single, rocky incline where no amount of defensive doctrine could save them. The true climax of the Battle of Guettar did not unfold in a sweeping clash of armor on the valley floor. It happened during the agonizing, days-long struggle for a jagged, unforgiving piece of terrain designated on military maps as Hill 369. As the American counteroffensive ground to a halt against deeply dug-in Axis positions, the battle degenerated from a synchronized, combined arms operation into a brutal contest of sheer infantry attrition. The men of the 1st Infantry Division were repeatedly ordered to assault near vertical, rocky slopes devoid of natural cover. German mortar crews, perfectly concealed on the ridgelines, rained highly accurate fire down onto the climbing Americans, while entrenched machine gun nests raked the exposed approaches. Outmaneuvering the enemy became geographically impossible in the vertical terrain. Every meter gained was paid for in heavy casualties. The American soldiers, who just days prior had perfectly executed a masterclass in disciplined defense, were now pushed to their absolute physical and psychological limits. They were ordered to conduct frontal assaults that their current tactical doctrine and their heavy, rigid supply chains simply could not support effectively in the mountains. The slaughter for Hill 369 became a grinding, meter-by-meter endurance test, yielding minimal territorial gain for a staggering human cost. When the fighting finally subsided in early April, the exhausted American army looked out over a battlefield that offered a profound dual reality. It was undeniable proof of their rapid institutional transformation, but it was also a sobering, bloody warning about the true, unyielding cost of military competence. If we return to the pre-dawn darkness of March 23rd, and the central question of whether an inexperienced army can truly adapt under fire, the shattered terrain of El Guettar provides the definitive answer. The battlefield proved that the humiliation of the Kasserine Pass was not a permanent mark of institutional inferiority. Rather, it was a brutal, completely necessary lesson in the realities of modern mechanized warfare. By successfully networking dense minefields, mobile tank destroyers, and massed, synchronized artillery into a single kill zone, the Americans demonstrated they possessed the discipline to systematically dismantle an elite German armored thrust. However, the heavy casualties and the grinding tactical failures of the subsequent hill offensives strip away any mythological gloss from this victory. The agonizing slog through the rocky defilades demystifies the event, showing clearly that military adaptation is not a sudden, triumphant leap, but a continuous, deeply painful process. The slaughter and the high ground prove that defensive competence does not automatically translate into offensive mastery. The United States Army had learned how to hold a line and break a panzer charge, but dislodging a dug-in enemy required an entirely different operational science that still had to be learned in blood. This sobering duality, a masterful defensive stand paired with a deeply flawed offensive struggle, fundamentally shifted the strategic landscape in North Africa. It redefined how both skeptical allies and veteran enemies viewed the American soldier for the rest of the war. El Guettar was far from a flawless victory, and it certainly did not mark the end of American tactical miscalculations on the long road to Berlin. But in the span of 30 brutal days, the men of the Second Corps permanently shattered the deeply held German illusion of American incompetence. When the dust finally settled over the Tunisian desert, one undeniable, lethal truth remained. The United States Army was no longer a collection of green amateurs, and they had finally learned how to fight.